It's
Yes,
not
ma'am.
DNA related, but there's a lot of those phone videos being done for crime scenes. Is that accepted in court?
Siguro sa evidence also.
No. Because I see, you see it on TV for
But actually, that's answering a
package,
limitation.
that.
That's answering a limitation. Usually, and Dr. Furtun, Raquel Furtun will be the better person to discuss this. There are basics in terms of photo documenting a crime scene sample. You need to be able to put a measuring ruler, just to get a scope, scaling, plus you should need to be able to do enough light, because then you need to be able to get all the features, etc. But the problem is we don't have those cameras. In PNP, I think they have only one or two for the entire. So I mean, they make do with what they've got rather than having to sketch.
Right.
Then they take the photo. So I think given that limitation. But then of course you've got Euro generals with bags of euros, so I don't know where the money is. not for the cameras. So yes.
Doctor, how long does it take for a DNA testing to be?
It depends on the type of samples and the amount of cleaning we need to do. So for example, with blood samples, we can do 2 days done.
Okay.
For bone samples, we need to dry, do sand, do the whole works. Could easily be from 2 weeks to 1 month.
Okay.
But how many days, months, years can sample last in terms of...
Depending how they're stored.
Yeah, I know, because we have cases here, as rape or sexual assault, taking about 5 years, and then how do we now go back to this?
Well, that's a challenge that Dr. Madrid has, because we've come up with what we call a sexual assault investigation kit. So these are swabs that we package. Actually, we don't have a commercial supplier here. So in my lab, because we realized the need for it, we validated a prototype. We're packing it. We're packing the kits. I think it's about 400 or 500 pesos, almost at cost. We're packing these kits just for the collection of samples, and we do it whoever asks us. Dr. Madrid, for her team, she's already been asking us a number of kits on a routine basis. We've sent some to Butuan. I think there's a high percentage. Now with those, we package them sterile. So it's got all the forms, etc. That's needed by the doctors. However, and then they are stored in the cold. We recommend that they're stored dried and in the cold. It lasts longer than if you store them at room temperature because of the temperature. However, one problem, particularly for anal swabs, because there are some contaminants, there would be fungi and molds that will grow. And also dependent on the level of hygiene of a child. So we've seen a spectrum of preservation of swabs from really moldy to really clean over years. So the best way, and our recommending is the moment you get it, you put it, you extract the DNA. Once you get the cells, kasi po, the skin cells from the body, those are the ones contaminated with microorganisms or molds. But the moment we break the cells open and get the DNA and put it on ice or in the freezer, that's immortal almost. That's the best way to preserve. That's how they do cold cases in the other countries. DNA.
Pero kasi tayo walang ganun. I've heard one of my colleagues, the PGS, social worker, and she was telling me na they have problems with storing this,
I know. That's Dr. Junlo Lopez. Dr. June Lopez, they had to burn. Sorry to say, I saw this. This was 2006. They were preparing to burn 300 rape kits. Why? Because the mice and the rats had gone in and eaten the samples. But this means that 300 women had been raped, and 300 women had been raped again for the collection because it's very intimate, and yet they were not processed. So it's a major issue. Now Dr. Madrid has a problem in her lab because she keeps on buying refrigerators. One, and this is a policy issue, one problem we've got with rape cases here in the Philippines is that, okay, we addressed the first question, how do you collect? You've got a prototype rape kit, which can be made available. We're asking DOH, we're really talking to DOST to talk to DOH. DOH, supply your government hospitals. No expiration date, these are plastics and swabs. Packed sterile, which means that it can last forever if you don't use it, you don't open it. And you can open it at need. stack some in your government hospitals when kids go there at 3 in the morning. Okay, now what the problem here is that Dr. Madrid has been, and her team had been collecting samples from kids that go to CPU. However, PNP and NBI refuse to take them
Because of the storage.
because of the storage, and also because they have a policy that they only take cases
Of their own.
Yeah.
of their own or cases where there's already a court order for the DNA test. Which also, if you look at the forensic diagram we had in the first place, the case is at the end.
Yes.
You should be doing it here at the beginning during the investigation to identify a suspect. So if the child at this stage realizes, nothing happens, I don't have even money to go and pay for my pamasahe to go to ride the jeep to the court. No more, I will not go. And in unfortunate to say, the 156 cases we caught, in the 63% of those that we've caught positive DNA, those have not been taken to court because we could not find the children. I mean, not really. Dr. Madrid could not find the children because the children didn't go back after their examination.
There's so many cases
so
of
many
that.
cases.
Oh my God.
But the problem is we've got very good DNA profiles.
The perpetrator will keep on doing it.
Yes.
Exactly. Which is what Dr. Madrid was saying. They've got cases, 3 girls in the family, 1, 2, 3. So I mean, those are challenges that we've got. So now, Dr. Madrid and her team is now being more selective. Usually, our principle is collect within 3 days post-contact. In post-contact, we've validated it, we've tested it. There remains biological sample until 3 days post-contact. But now, because of the difficulty in storing those samples, Dr. Madrid and her team are a bit more selective
So,
because they don't have any more space.
24 hours na lang sila.
I don't know how they fix their selection process. But, because they cannot fit anymore in there.
That's a problem. They can find later.
So, mind you though, the number of undone rape kits that are not being done is not only the problem here in the Philippines. There are heaps of reports also in the US where rape cases are not being done. So are not processed. So it's really a I think one thing that's a challenge for us is to show government that we can make it happen. In other words, there should be 1 or 2 cases where really it should be your landmark case to show them how useful it could be to
Do we
protect
have
the
a
rights.
system here like the one you see on TV? You have the DNA already, markers already, or the DNA of all the suspects. Diba? They run it through.
We don't have a criminal database.
We don't have a
Why?
criminal
Because we
database.
need the DNA law.
Yeah.
I mean, there are again the issue of storage is there.
So
with the rule on DNA evidence, and I know this because I was in a discussion with the Philippine Judicial Academy. Joey Ochavin and myself, we were doing the drafts of the rule, and we can only take it so much as what is present in the rules of court. But to have a criminal database requires DNA legislation because you're introducing the principles of privacy and principles of the main thing is privacy, genetic privacy of individuals, which requires legislation. Plus, it will require a big investment. Where will it come from? So it has to be legislated. So now
Actually, if we could have a DNA database and we could process more cases faster, we probably save the government more money.
economically it is.
I mean, instead of parang detaining so many people for so many years, if you could run the
You know, we
cases.
did a case. We did a case. This case, I don't know if it's in the slides, but we did a case where a man was charged with raping a young girl, and he was the kapitbahay, the neighbor, and he was jailed for over 6 years. We calculated with food about 10-15 pesos a day, etc.
Cost of detaining a
It was
perpetrator.
over 200,000 pesos.
Spending
And we did
for-
the test for 45,000. Plus, of course, the human rights issue. He wasn't the father of the child. And the only thing, the reason why the judge ordered the DNA test was the woman was mentally retarded. She was the age of 11, physical age of 21, but mental age of 11. And so there were accusations that the family was trying to get money from him, etc. So the judge couldn't decide whether to do DNA test. There were a lot of contradictions in the testimony of the victim, which was understandable because of her mental age, etc. But then the question of proper identification, because she didn't relate. And we tested and it wasn't him. So eventually, after 3 months, he was in jail for 6 years on testimonial evidence. 3 months after we submitted the case report, he was acquitted. So over 200,000 of government money, they could have, and then of course the guy was in jail when he was 27, got out at 33, 34, and he wasn't a very happy man.
If the court orders for a DNA test, who pays for it?
If it's NBI or PNP, that's part of their budget. If it's us, somebody has to cover it. So usually, if it's not in any of the projects that we've got, such as we had the project with Bernie, so that's done. It was a World Bank sponsored, so we did cases for her. We've got DNA Pro Kits now for child trafficking cases, which we can cover. But if it's not, then has to be victim, or the victim has to have sponsors. Which, you mind you, it has been done because we had this rape victim. Again, she wanted her case to be, she was very determined. She wrote to the senators and the congressman, and we were getting, because PGH has a budget for the congressman on free medical whatever. PDAF. Which is now no more. Which is now no more. But at that time, she was getting 2,000 from this senator, 5,000 from this congressman, 3,000. So she pulled the whole lot. She was a very determined victim. She pulled everything, totaled what we needed. We did her case on sponsorship. Of course, we facilitated getting the money from her. That's what we can do. We facilitated getting the money from UP Manila to UP Diliman. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. So we're able to do that. We were able to do her case, not on her.
Which one are you doing it?
I'm not sure we can cover it, but the other point that we wanted to cover, Sana, was but there's this new study, not so new, mga 2008, 2010, about how being exposed to violence can alter the connections
we emailed each other in this
between
one.
Yeah.
How is,
Okay.
can we cover that briefly or
briefly.
another?
No, there was a study, I don't have the material here, but it was a study that I think it was a New England Journal of Medicine, where there was a comparison over time of children that were in institutions. Tapos their brains were scanned using magnetic resonance imaging, and it was shown that there were areas there that were actually turned off. And from what I recall.
Yeah, that's one. That's one. But there's also another study that talks about how if a person is is exposed to violence, it can actually affect the connections between the DNA, and then but this can have serious repercussions. It could be one of the reasons for that cycle of abuse, because I think it can be passed on, but it can also be remedied. Like if a person gets adequate care, these defective signals between the DNA can actually still be repaired.
I'll have to check that one. I think I got the NEJM paper.
If we could look into that, because that also has a big effect on how we understand violence and how we can advocate for work against violence.
Do you remember which journalist?
I can look it up.
Send it out.
Relatedly, I don't know if you have encountered that. There is a journal called Nature Neuroscience. It's published by Cambridge and Birmingham University in England. The proposition is that, I think this dovetails the old theory on psychoanalysis, on the question of whether memory is diminished or as it is overshadowed, or does memory become weaker because of the acquisition of new imprints of information. The proposition of this new study is that the first proposition is that memory is stored, and if at all there is new information that comes up, it stays there. However, the other question, the other study would indicate that memory is weakened and degraded by new information that comes in. The distinction is significant because it would warrant the possibility of meaningful intervention for psychoanalytic rehabilitation. But it would seem that it would appear to me that England is at the forefront of this kind of research for psychoanalysis. Now, there is also an indication about what you're saying, that there is a chemical reaction that happens to the body that impacts the DNA, that predetermines how they behave in the future in reaction to a traumatic experience, whether as a victim of violence or a natural occurrence.
Okay. Well, that's actually very interesting because we've encountered, and I don't have the explanation for this yet, but we've encountered individuals who really are, I would say it's in denial, but you know that it didn't happen or it happened, but in their testimony are actually saying, because you have the DNA evidence,
Right.
you've got it, but in the way they talk to you, the way they explain how things happen, is totally opposite what you're actually seeing.
There is objective evidence, but their testimony will
Parang,
yes.
and this is something,
Either dissociated or they zoned out of that experience.
exactly. So that's something that we had been asking the psychiatrists to be able to analyze it. And they said that incidents like this, particularly very traumatic incidences, actually, this is actually possible. I don't fully understand it. We will check.
I'll send you the links about that. Because that's one of the. Kasi now there's a lot of there's a lot of groups advocating for increased investment on fighting violence, and one of the things that they're trying to show is that if children, because there are already studies that show that if children have adverse childhood experiences like violence in early life, it has lifelong health consequences, especially in terms of chronic diseases and so on. So we're trying to prove that if you're able to address violence while a child is still a child, then hopefully you can reverse those, you can help to avoid those other adverse health consequences. So we need to make a case about why we need to invest on, combating violence as early as possible. And one of them is the problem about the DNA. Because if you're not able to address it, and then it gets passed on through the DNA, through the interconnections between the DNA, that means it will affect several generations.
Which brings me to the question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is our DNA blueprint permanent, eternal, perpetual? Or can it be altered? For example, in that proposition, can it be altered by a chemical reaction to a violent experience in such that your DNA is effectively modified, and when you pass it on to your children, what is the manifestation of your DNA? Is it if that proposition is true, has it been altered permanently as well?
Okay. Now we're going to the very edge of. Well, there's a suggestion of nature versus nurture always. So that's been a perennial question in biology: nature versus nurture. So your question is: there's a blueprint, but also the blueprint. There's DNA kasi, and then with DNA, it has your map, but depending on what you do, there is the selective expression of proteins, expression of DNA in terms of protein. So for example, in our life, what we eat, what we do if we expose ourselves in the sun, it affects your DNA blueprint is there, but what comes out of it, what is expressed as proteins that affect your metabolism is also affected. So if you violate your body by the type of living that you do, the alcohol that you drink, the drugs that you drink, that will affect what proteins are released, and that will affect your metabolism. Now your question is, can it go back to your DNA such that the violations you did to your body could impact to a certain extent on the blueprint? To a certain extent, I can answer yes, at least to a certain level. Why? Because that's the field of cancer. the way we've treated our body here in terms of the expression of proteins, cancer is the disease of our tissues, of our organs, where there is a weakening in the replication machinery of the cell. The cell keeps on replicating even if it hasn't matured. That's why it no longer has functions that the functions are affected. Exactly what triggers that we don't know, but there has to be a trigger somewhere, and that's a big million-dollar question. What triggers? And there's usually an associated hormonal, for example, in breast cancer, there are certain hormones that are actually liver cancer, lung cancer, for example. The amount, and it has been shown, the amount of smoking or secondary smoking that one inhales affects. That's why you've got effect on your replication, which eventually will affect your cell replication machinery. So your DNA is there to replicate, but how it replicates has been affected. Now your question here, and I don't have the specific answer exactly, will this be affected, etc.? The main blueprint yet. I'll have to answer you on that one, specifically on that question, because I think it does. Because there is what we call mutations or changes of DNA. And usually it's single base mutations when you've got, it's not big things, but usually it's single base changes, which if properly located can affect function. And this is how we have evolved over time, from the monkeys to humans, from the Neanderthals to the Homo sapiens, etc. So over time, over a long period of time, and this is what we call evolution, there have been base changes. There's positive selection for what characteristics are good for us in our present environment. That's a big field of research that we're trying to do now. So we got it over, the ones that are not beneficial for us, in relation to the changing times, are discarded. For example, in the Philippines, we don't drink a lot of milk. So we're lactose intolerant. Many of us are lactose intolerant.
Right.
If you go to Europe, there's a much lesser percentage of lactose intolerance. Why? Because it's part of the diet. So there's already a change in the DNA over time because of the environment. I guess that's a principle that I think is now being okay, we're talking about continents and environment of food, but what about environments of violence? Will that also affect? And that admittedly I have not looked into that field. What if the violence is is that type of environment? Can it also, looking at that principle, potentially I cannot say no, because it's also an environment that can induce changes, and it could be a signal for survival of the fittest. If for example the child is always hyper because of fight or flight mode, can that affect her?
For example, if you think of Palestinian children, for example, who have been farmed, or even people in Mindanao. Kasi Mindanao, for example, in many of the Muslim areas, they claim that we've been at war for 400 years. Which is in a way historically correct.
And they're always like this.
The same is true with the Jews. There are extensive studies that will explain why there is a critical mass of genius among the Jews. They're saying it's the history of persecution that develops in them a secondary instinctive reaction and highlights their
Jewish,
best characteristics in terms of coping, survival.
With the Jewish, though, they also have the genius and they also have the disability.
Yeah.
They have more percentage.
Really?
Yes,
Yes,
and that's
I
why
know that
they have
too.
developed very good programs. Because I work in special education. But also they're talking about like ADHD, the prevalence of the children being diagnosed with ADHD or bipolar or the emotional sensitivities of children compared to what just within a generation or thinking of what we were like when we were young, what we get exposed to, and the vulnerabilities of children.
Actually, I heard Queen Alichua talk about this issue. They had this project, and I think it's also another type of environment. What the challenges that educate them as educators are facing now is the increased percentage of attention deficit. Why? Because of the gadgets.
Yes.
You get a lot.
The stimulation.
The stimulation is there. She says that she's got students in her class who actually are violent if you take the gadgets away from them, or who fidget if they are not. So, and then when she starts, then they had this whole big study. She's got a book on the digital age.
Yeah.
It's published at National Bookstore.
Yeah.
It's a good book. It's a lot of examples of what they've got in their study, and it's really a change in the psychology of young kids, because now they've got laptops, gadgets. It's different. And ang hirap because the teachers are unable to change costumes every 3 seconds.
That's right.
Unlike your computer games,
That's
where
true,
the
that's
kids
true.
are so
Yeah.
stimulated because wow, 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 change character, boom, 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 sequences. I cannot change clothes every 3 seconds. So
the teachers are still, the schools are in analog style, the
Yeah.
children
Yeah.
are already in the digital.
and
age.
so they've got students who are not getting the education.
And yet the IQs of children are higher using the old
Oh.
measures now.
But-
Nowadays.
The IQs.
The IQ numbers are higher, but their ability to focus, attend, sit down,
Yeah, no, but
be
here,
managed in
that's
schools.
actually one question that I had discussed with her. The IQs, because the way we form the questions for IQ tests, are all more informative. But one challenge that I've got in the sciences when I get my research students is they are not analytical. You get them to go in depth into a question and they find it very, very difficult.
But is that Philippines or?
I don't know, I haven't read.
Because I find the education system generally for our country is very rote information oriented, more oriented to
Memorization.
memory.
Yeah.
and
Because
speaking.
at least in the sciences, you know why that's one of the case? Because we don't have enough funding to be able to get people to touch the actual test tubes
Yes.
and to do their own experiments. Usually the way science classes are conducted, you've got one experiment everybody watches. In other countries, like I finished my degree in Australia, you have your own test tubes. If it explodes, it's really up to you to unexplode it. But you know, you've got to do it. So that's, I think, is a challenge for us. And even in the book, that when she was telling us about the book, the people in the US that does a lot of the Google, they are not allowing their kids to go to gadget schools.
Gadgets.
Yeah.
In their
There are
schools, they are
certain
computer and gadget free
Yeah, well,
because they want
Waldorf
they want their kids to be able to do hand calculations. And they've got Google. They're the bosses in Google and the digital age, but their kids are not
But
doing it
not
because they've
public
got
school. Public school, you're so wired.
So
Unfortunately. It's the private schools that are resisting. Like Waldorf, they don't allow and they tell their parents, don't allow your child until grade 4. Because they stop reading. If you give them those, it's sad. I have my own grandnephews, grandnieces. They all have their own tablets. And I've been telling them, but you can't. Here in the Philippines, you just have everything, right? Apparently, they don't read anymore. They don't read books anymore. But Waldorf schools, they do not allow their students to have access to anything technological until grade 4. That's the idea. So there's research to say this is what you should be doing, but with all the gadgetry and we're ahead, right? Technology.
So that's why my question there is with ADHD, what are the chemicals that are turned on? Will that affect the environment of your brain such that there could be changes? And we don't know because that's what happens. It's a chemical interaction there.
How
Will it
far
affect-
does the expression manifest itself that it grows positively?
That's a good question, huh? That is something that is worthwhile looking into. We'll have to pull out some.
So that can be the topic of our next brown bag.
It's a brown bag.
Huh?
brown bag.
Actually, it's no bags. We'll just have it there.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's
We'll just finish. We'll just
Yeah.
finish it up.
Yeah.
This will answer to some of your questions. So DNA is inherited.
Okay.
So DNA is stable more than protein. So these are some of our explanations over certain
There's
years.
no settled
Time?
proposition about whether, for example, is a person 75% an expression of his genetic makeup, or is it 20? And how much percentage is nurturing and environment?
No, there's none. So that's a big question. How much is nature versus nurture? Because even in many situations, which is also amazing, we conquer our own challenges. I mean, I just saw an article. There's a boy now in the Philippine Science High School who's in the poverty area across the Balot Vendor. He was able to conquer his poverty, and now he is a scholar in the school where it's so difficult to get in. What made him do it? What he was able to do. But there are certain kids, you give them everything and they still fail everything. So there are nature versus nurture.
I have a lot of older siblings, and they're saying, as you get older, you realize it's mostly genetic. It's like we're seeing.
You're stressing your moms.
Well, you try so hard not to be like the parents, or you're doing all this.
And you become
Your
like
diet's different, your lifestyle is different. In the end, you're very similar to your parents in terms of your behavior.
Yes, ma'am.
Doctor, what about homosexuality? It's actually a very big.
There's a very good question in terms of nature versus nurture. Some people argue that it is
Yeah.
because who I am.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But I think there's a big factor in terms of nurture there. There are only some syndromes there are some syndromes which have an extra X,
Mhm.
like XXYs.
Mhm.
But they're not very, very high in proportion to the number of homosexuals that we do have. I suspect there's a lot of culture influence there. So, I mean, it's very, very hard to say it's biological.
But there is a study, I remember, this was some 10 years old already. A lobotomy was done by the Harvard Medical Facility in Harvard of practicing homosexuals. And the statistically significant finding was that practicing homosexuals have a bigger basal ganglia, the lower portion of the brain.
Yeah.
And so the debate is, did that portion of, so this is a shared characteristic of all practicing homosexuals. The base of the brain is measured to be bigger than heterosexuals. So the debate is, what triggered the increase in the size? Is it the fact that they're practicing, or were they born with a bigger basal ganglia?
Okay.
Did they include non-practicing
Yeah.
homosexuals?
Sometimes kasi ma'am, in the
The study was limited to practicing
just
homosexuals.
because
Orientation.
those types of studies, I don't know if this particular study, but those types of studies, sometimes when you really look, it's always a hot debate. But as your question is, what is the control sample that was compared as to the size of the basal ganglia? Kasi there had been, for example, in the mid-80s or early 90s, there was a big discussion on the violence gene, the gene responsible for violence. Because the criminals have a high percentage of this. But then you realize when you read the paper, paano naman your subjects are all in jail. Where is the matching control?
Right.
So, what did you do your statistics about? So I don't know for this particular study, ma'am, but I think those are things that need to be looked into. But really, in terms of behavior and personal, and this is not expertise, but personal, I think there's a lot of culture and the environment, the family, extended or short, influence in terms of how this is developed. Although in some of the shows that you see, they've got the one I saw on YouTube. Hindi, three. There are 4 guys in a family, and 3 are homosexuals.
Yeah.
So
But also the twin studies who are reared apart, it shows a lot of the genetics in their expressions of their lives are very similar. They have different upbringing. They have
Similar.
very similar lives.
there's also in terms of the homosexuality, there's also kasi the hormones, the male hormones. I don't know if that was included in the study. So we know that if certain people take more male hormones, their physique, their behavior, like for example, Charissa, I suspect is taking some because of the way because the way her body has changed.
Yeah.
I suspect, I don't know, but I think she might be taking because she can take them artificially. So if that's the case, then it could actually. But then it's a choice to take them. What made her take that choice? I think those are very complex questions.
in relation to violence, there are a lot of clients, you know, especially those survivors of sexual abuse. They are having this option for, you know, homosexuality and the relationships of girl to girl.
Because they don't trust men.
Yeah, probably they don't trust men, and sometimes also they are more inclined to have relationships with girls. And there's still a lot of them. Even if they grew up, they're going to
It's a question also of since you know the security.
security,
Security, I guess.
and something psychological, you know.
When I lived in Hong Kong, when we go to church, you'll see there are only women domestic. So they're women, right? And there were way more. Like in the church, you saw those couples, the lesbian couples, Filipino. Catholic church is mostly Filipinos, I think. So when we would go to church, we were just so surprised at the numbers of lesbian couples.
But it could also be the way we design our shelters because it's all girls. If they don't have, if we don't bring them up with, to have access to the opposite sex, like in the ordinary school, or to have interconnection with the boys in the community, then they're in a confined space. That can also be.
But I think EPA is more open than any other shelters because it's able to integrate with the children in the communities. And they're going to mainstream school, no? That school exclusive for girls. They're exposed, no?
It will also be because they don't trust.
Yeah, I think some of the effects of the abuse could be
The trauma.
trauma.